The woman touched my arm just as I was about to walk away from my son's grave. "Sir." Her voice was quiet, deliberate. "I need to speak with you." I turned around. I didn't recognize her. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, dark coat, no umbrella despite the drizzle, standing close enough that I could see her eyes clearly. She didn't look like anyone from the neighborhood. She didn't look like anyone who had known my son. "Not now," I said. I was polite about it, but firm. 8 months of coming to this cemetery had taught me how to deflect strangers who wanted to talk about grief. Grief, I'd learned, makes other people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people say strange things. She didn't step back. "Your son didn't die in that fire." I stopped. The rain fell steadily on the headstone behind me. "Thomas Allen Greer," it said. "Beloved son, loving husband, devoted father. The 14th of September, 1981, the 3rd of March, 2025. My boy, my firstborn, gone at 43 years old in a warehouse fire that the investigators had ruled accidental, the building old, the wiring older, nothing suspicious, just a terrible piece of bad luck that had taken my son and left a hole in our family that I didn't know how to talk about or walk around or fill." I said, "What did you just say to me?" She didn't flinch. She said it again. "Your son didn't die in that fire." And then she added, before I could respond, before I could even finish processing what she'd said, "I know this is not what you expected to hear. I know you have every reason to tell me to leave, but I need you to listen to me for the next 60 seconds. After that, you can do whatever you want. Walk away, call someone, have me removed. But 60 seconds. I have no idea why I nodded. I don't know if it was the steadiness in her voice, or the way the rain was falling, or the fact that grief does something strange to a person after 8 months, makes you open to things you would have dismissed in another life. I nodded, and she talked. She said her name was Carol. She said she couldn't tell me anything else about herself. Not yet. Not here. She said my son had known this day would come, had asked her to be the one to make contact, had made her promise she would wait until he was certain the timing was right. She reached into her coat and held out an envelope. It was sealed, no stamp, no return address. Just my name written on the front in handwriting I would recognize anywhere, because it was the same handwriting that had signed my birthday cards for 43 years. "Don't go home tonight." She said it the same way you'd say, "Don't step into the street when a car is coming," like the urgency was self-evident. "Go to the marina on the east side of town, slip 9. There's a blue boat, the Caroline. Someone will be waiting." She turned and walked between the headstones, and within 30 seconds, she had disappeared entirely. I stood at my son's grave holding an envelope addressed in my dead son's handwriting, and I didn't know which way was up. My phone buzzed, a text from my wife. "Come home right now. Something's happened. Don't stop anywhere." I read the message 3 times. My wife doesn't text that way. After 40 years of marriage, I know every register of her voice and her written words. She says sweetheart. She says when you get a chance. She sends long messages with too many details about things that happened while I was out. She does not send 4-word commands with no greeting. She does not say don't stop anywhere. I looked at Carol's retreating path through the cemetery. I looked at the envelope in my hand. I looked at my phone. Then I got in my car. I didn't go home. I drove to a parking lot 3 blocks from the cemetery and sat there with the engine running and opened the envelope. My hands were not steady. The paper inside was folded in thirds, yellow at the edges like it had been sealed for a long time. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means Carol found you, which means I've run out of time to do this differently. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that this is how you're finding out. I know what this has done to you and Mom and everyone else. I know you've been standing at that headstone for 8 months, thinking I was under the ground. I have thought about that every single day, and it has nearly broken me every single day. But I didn't have a choice, and by the time you finish reading this, I hope you'll understand that even if you can never forgive me for it. Here is what I need you to know right now. The text you got from Mom, if it came, is not from her. It's from them. They've been watching you because they know I'm not dead and they think I'll surface if they put enough pressure on the people I love. Mom is fine. She's with Aunt Ruth. She drove there this morning because Carol arranged it, and Mom is the only person in this world who has known the truth from the beginning, and she has carried that for 8 months, and I know what that cost her, and I'm sorry for that too. Don't go home. Not yet. Slip 9 at the East Marina. The Caroline. Carol will meet you there. I will explain everything. I love you, Dad. I've loved you my whole life. Everything I did to keep you safe. Trust Carol. Go to the boat. Don't go home. I sat in that parking lot for a very long time. Or maybe it was 2 minutes. I'm not sure time was working correctly for me in that moment. Then I drove to the marina. The East Marina is the older part of the waterfront, the part that the development money hasn't reached yet, all weather-beaten docks and salt-stained boards and boats that look like they've been through every storm the Atlantic ever produced. Slip 9 was at the far end of the second dock. The boat was there, blue hull, modest size, the Caroline hand-painted on the stern in white letters. Carol was on the dock. She had a different look about her now, more formal, a badge in her hand that she showed me as I approached. Special Agent Carol Simmons, DEA. I said, "The DEA?" She said, "Come aboard. There's a lot to tell you." My son was sitting at a folding table below deck. He looked up when I came down the steps and I stopped completely. Because 8 months of grief has a physical weight to it that you don't notice until something removes it all at once, and in that moment everything inside my chest went loose and disorganized, and I couldn't speak. He stood up and crossed the space between us and put his arms around me and said, "I know, Dad, I know." We stood like that for a while. I'm not embarrassed to say that. I'm 63 years old, and I had buried my son, and he was standing in front of me breathing, and I stood in the galley of that boat and I held on. When I finally found my voice, I said, "You have some explaining to do." He almost smiled. He looked older than 43. He looked like someone who had spent 8 months not sleeping well. He said, "Sit down. It's going to take a while." It took the better part of 2 hours. Agent Simmons sat with us and filled in the parts he couldn't bring himself to say. The story started 4 years before the fire. My son had been working as a logistics manager for a regional freight company, moving goods up and down the East Coast, a job I had never understood in any detail because I was a firefighter for 31 years and anything involving spreadsheets and supply chains was beyond me. What I hadn't known, what none of us had known, was that the freight company had been quietly acquired 18 months before my son took the job, quietly and through enough shell companies that the acquisition was nearly impossible to trace. The man behind it was named Marcus Holt. Holt had spent 20 years building a distribution network for a narcotics operation that moved product from the southern border to 12 states along the coast. He didn't move it in the obvious ways, not in cars driven by people who could be stopped and searched. He moved it through legitimate freight, through pallets of goods with clean manifests, through a paper trail that looked like nothing but ordinary commerce. He needed logistics people who were good at their jobs and who wouldn't ask too many questions about why certain shipments had to be handled by certain drivers and delivered to certain addresses and never tracked past the final. Doc. My son was very good at his job. He figured it out in pieces. A manifest that didn't match the weight. A driver who was on the schedule 1 week and gone the next, without any record of resignation. A warehouse address that, when he looked it up out of curiosity, didn't correspond to any registered business. He could have walked away. That's the thing he kept saying as he told the story. He said, "I could have quit and pretended I hadn't seen anything." He said, "People do that every day. People see things they're not supposed to see, and they make the practical choice." But he went to the DEA instead. Agent Simmons took over that part of the story. She said my son had come to their field office on a Tuesday afternoon without an appointment and laid out what he knew. And what he knew, once they looked into it, was enough to begin building a case they had been trying to build for 11 years. He agreed to stay in his position. He agreed to document. He agreed to wear a wire at 2 meetings. Not undercover work, not anything theatrical, just sitting in rooms where things were said and making sure those things were recorded. The case took 2 years to build. At the end of it, Marcus Holt was indicted on 37 counts. The day before the indictment was to be unsealed, someone inside the operation learned that there was a cooperating witness inside the freight company. They didn't know who, but they were looking. My son made the decision with Agent Simmons and her supervisor. There was a fire. It happened late at night in a building where my son had a reason to be. The investigation would conclude what it concluded. My son would disappear into a protected situation with a new identity in a new city, and Marcus Holt would go to prison believing that the one person who could testify against him in any future proceedings was dead. "And your mother," I said. "You told your mother." He looked at the table. "I couldn't do it to her," he said. "I couldn't ask her to grieve me completely. I told her the week before. I swore her to silence." He paused. "I know how much that cost her. Keeping it from you especially, you and her. I thought about my wife then. 40 years married. The way she had been in those 8 months, steady in front of me, holding me together. And I had thought it was just strength. I had thought it was just the way she was built. The idea that she had been carrying the knowledge that our son was alive, carrying it alone, carrying it to protect me, made something shift deep in my chest. But why not me? I asked. Why did she know, and not me? My son met my eyes. Because you would have gone looking, Dad. You would have needed to see me, and if you'd come looking, they would have followed you. He was right. I knew he was right without wanting to admit it. I asked about Marcus Holt. That's the problem. Agent Simmons leaned forward. Holt's attorneys have spent the last 2 years finding procedural reasons to delay. He's still incarcerated pending trial, but the trial date has been pushed 3 times. Last month, we became aware that Holt had put out a contract. His people outside were tasked with identifying the witness who had provided the original cooperation. They've narrowed it down. They've been watching your family for the past 6 weeks. And the text from my wife. Simmons nodded. We don't believe it came from her. We believe your phone was targeted and the number was spoofed. They're trying to draw you home. If they could get you walking through your front door in a state of confusion or panic, they could question you about your son, so they still don't know he's alive. They suspect it. They don't have confirmation. But if they get to you or to your daughter-in-law or to the children, I thought about my daughter-in-law then. I thought about my grandchildren, 8 years old and 5 years old, growing up with a photograph of their father on the mantel, visiting a headstone on Sundays. Where are they? I asked. My daughter-in-law. The grandchildren. Agent Simmons checked her phone. Currently at the aquarium. We've had 2 agents with them since this morning. They're safe. Does she know? Does my daughter-in-law know? My son shook his head. She doesn't know I'm alive. He said it quietly, like the words cost him something. I haven't been able to tell her. For the same reason I couldn't tell you. Because if she knew, she might look for me. And if she looked, they'd follow. How long? I asked. How long does this go on? Simmons said, that depends on the next 48 hours. There was a plan. There had apparently been a plan building for several weeks, and my arrival today, my son's letter, Carol approaching me at the cemetery, all of it had been triggered by something that had happened 3 days earlier. One of Holt's men had made contact with a former employee of the freight company, someone who remembered my son, someone who had been asked questions about whether anyone had seemed particularly close to him in the months before the fire. The window for waiting had closed. They needed to move. The plan was to give Holt's people what they were looking for, but on controlled terms. If my son surfaced, if he made himself visible, Holt's organization would report back to Holt in prison. Holt would attempt to make contact. The DEA had been building a secondary case against Holt's prison communications for 8 months, and if Holt reached out to an outside contact to deal with a surfaced witness, they'd have him on conspiracy charges that would make his existing indictment look minor. But my son would need to be genuinely visible. He would need to be somewhere Holt's people were watching. He would need to appear unprotected. I don't like this, I said. I know. You're using yourself as bait. He said, I've been in hiding for 8 months, Dad. My wife thinks I'm dead. My kids grew up 3 inches without me. My mother has been holding a secret that nearly broke her. He shook his head. I'm not going to hide anymore. I'm ending this. Agent Simmons laid out the specifics. I listened. I pushed back on several points. She accepted one of my revisions and rejected the others, with explanations that were frustrating because they were correct. My son watched us argue with an expression that was somewhere between exhausted and amused. At the end of it, I said, "Where do you need me to be?" Simmons and my son exchanged a look. "You should stay on the boat," she said. I looked at my son. He looked back at me. He knew better than to tell me to stay on the boat. The operation happened the following evening. I will not pretend I was anything other than terrified. I'm a retired firefighter. I have walked into burning buildings dozens of times, and I understand the particular quality of physical fear, the way it sharpens certain things and blurs others. But nothing I experienced in 31 years of that work compared to standing in the shadows of a parking structure, watching my son walk across an open lot toward a vehicle that had been identified as belonging to one of Holt's men. My son walked slowly. He kept his hands visible. He was wired and had an earpiece, and Agent Simmons was in a van 40 yards away with a team of 6 agents. The man in the car recognized my son immediately. I could see it in the way the man's body changed. The sudden alertness, the hand reaching for a phone. That phone call was the thread they needed. Holt, from inside a federal facility, received a call on a line he had believed was secure. What he said, in response to the news that his target was alive, was recorded in its entirety by the DEA and would later be entered into evidence in a criminal proceeding that added 14 years to his eventual sentence. My son did not move toward the car. He stood exactly where Agent Simmons had positioned him, visible and still, long enough for the call to be made and recorded. And then 3 things happened simultaneously. 2 agents appeared from behind vehicles on either side of Holt's man. Simmons' voice came through the radio, and my son turned and walked back toward where I was standing. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally been allowed to put it down. "Is it done?" I asked. He said, "It's done." We stood there for a moment in the shadow of that parking structure, my son and I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I had when he was small, when he'd had a nightmare or scraped his knee or needed to know that someone was there, and he let me, and neither of us said anything. The following 3 days were complicated in the way that anything involving federal agencies and legal proceedings and the dismantling of a criminal network tends to be complicated. There were hours of debriefing. There were attorneys. There were documents. But on the 3rd morning, my son walked out of a DEA field office and into the parking lot where his wife was waiting. I didn't watch that reunion. That moment belonged to the 2 of them. I waited with the grandchildren in the lobby of the building, my granddaughter sitting on my knee, my grandson leaning against my arm, and I answered their questions the best I could. They wanted to know where their dad had been. I said he had been far away, but he was back now. They wanted to know if he was staying. I said yes, he was staying. My granddaughter looked up at me with her father's eyes and said, "We missed him, Grandpa." "I know, sweetheart," I said. "So did I." My wife came to the field office that afternoon. We hadn't spoken since before the cemetery. I had sent her a message through Agent Simmons just to say I was safe and to wait, and she had waited without calling, which told me she had understood. When I saw her in the lobby, she looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I kept it from you. I'm sorry for 8 months of watching you grieve and not being able to tell you." I held her for a while without answering. Then I said, "You did what he needed you to do. You protected him. That's what we do." She pulled back and looked at me. She said, "Are you angry?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I don't know yet. Ask me in a year." She laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh in 8 months, and it sounded like something being restored. There were things to untangle. My son could not simply step back into his previous life. There were legal processes involved in the dissolution of a false death record. There were conversations with employers and neighbors and the extended family that had attended a funeral and signed a guest book and brought casseroles to our house for 2 weeks afterward. There was a headstone in a cemetery that needed to be dealt with. There were also conversations that needed to happen within the family, with my daughter-in-law, who had done everything right for 8 months, who had raised 2 children through grief and kept her composure and held a memorial and continued, and who deserved something better than to find out that her husband had been alive through all of it. She was angry. She had every right to be. She and my son had long and difficult conversations that I was not present for, conversations that stretched across several weeks, conversations that I understand were not easy and did not reach simple resolutions quickly. That is the honest version. Love does not excuse a lie, even a lie told for the right reasons. It takes time to rebuild what a deception costs, but they worked at it. 2 years have passed since the cemetery, since Carol appearing at my son's headstone in the rain, since the envelope with his handwriting on it and the drive to the marina and the first sight of his face below deck on that boat. I'm 65 now. My wife and I moved to a smaller house on the same street, close enough to our son and his family that my grandchildren can walk over without anyone needing to drive. Sunday dinners happen most weeks when schedules allow. My granddaughter, who is 10, has started asking me about my years in the fire department, questions that are more detailed than I'd expected from someone her age, and I answer them honestly and at length because she asks with such genuine interest that it seems wrong to give her anything less. My son went back to work in logistics. Different company, different part of the country, nothing with any connection to his previous employer. He seems settled. He seems lighter than he was before the fire, which is strange because the years between have been harder than anything before them, but secrets have weight. And he carried his for 4 years before the fire and 8 months after, and the absence of that weight is visible in him in ways that are difficult to describe precisely. He laughs easier. He's present when he's in a room. Marcus Holt's trial concluded 14 months ago. He was convicted on 41 counts, including the conspiracy charge arising from the parking lot phone call. He will not be out of prison in my lifetime, and I am 65 years old, so that is a reasonable amount of comfort. My wife and I went to the cemetery together on what would have been the 1-year anniversary of the fire. We brought the documents from the county showing that the death record had been formally vacated, which is the kind of thing you do not expect to carry in a folder to a cemetery, but there it was. We stood at the headstone that still had our son's name on it because the process of removing headstones is apparently lengthy and administrative, and we looked at it together for a while. My wife said, "What do you think when you look at it now?" I thought about that. I said, "I think about the year I spent believing it. I think about what grief is and what it does. And I think about the fact that the thing I grieved turned out not to be true. Does that make the grief feel wasted?" she asked. "No," I said. "The grief was real. The love underneath it was real. I just got to find out that I get more time with it than I thought." I got a note from Agent Simmons last Christmas. Not a card, just a note, professional, brief. She said the case had been cited in a training program for new agents as an example of long-term cooperative witness management. She said she hoped the family was well. She said my son was one of the most courageous people she had encountered in 20 years with the DEA, not because of the warehouse or the operation, but because he had kept showing up every day for 2 years to do something that frightened him, without recognition, without anyone knowing, because it was the right thing. I framed that note. I keep it in the small room off the kitchen where I do my reading. Across from it is a photograph of my son at about age 12, holding a fishing rod and looking at the camera with the expression of someone who can't quite believe his luck. I remember taking that picture. I remember the afternoon it came from, a lake upstate, just the 2 of us. Nothing particular about it except the light and the quiet and the feeling of having nowhere else to be. I look at both of those things most mornings when I come in to read, the note and the photograph, and I think about what it cost my son to do what he did, and what it cost his mother to carry it, and what it cost all of us in different ways, and I think about whether the cost was worth the outcome. I think it was. That is not a simple answer, and I don't offer it as one. There are things about those 8 months that I will carry for the rest of my life. A weight that doesn't fully go away. But my son is alive. My grandchildren have their father. My wife and I have our family intact, and we know now, in a way that you can only know after you believe you've lost something, exactly how much that is worth. The other day, my grandson came over after school and sat at the kitchen table while I was making coffee and said, "Grandpa, were you scared?" I asked him what he meant. He said, "When you found out the truth. About everything. Were you scared?" I thought about standing at the edge of that parking structure in the dark, watching my son walk out into an open lot. I thought about 8 months of headstones and casseroles and the particular silence of grief. I thought about an envelope with familiar handwriting in the rain. "Yes," I said. I was scared. But scared and willing to keep going are not the same thing. Sometimes you're scared and you keep going anyway because the person in front of you is worth it. He considered that. Then he said, "Okay," and went to look for a snack, which is what a 9-year-old does with a serious answer. But he heard it. I know he heard it. My son called last night, just to talk. Nothing important happened on the call. He asked about my knee, which has been giving me trouble. He told me something funny that had happened at my grandson's soccer practice. We talked for about 20 minutes and then said goodnight. "I love you. I'll talk to you tomorrow." After I hung up, I sat for a moment in the quiet of the living room and thought about how ordinary that had felt. A son calling his father. 20 minutes of nothing much. Good night and tomorrow and love. Ordinary is not nothing. Ordinary, I've learned, is everything. If you've stayed with me this long, I want to ask you something. If someone you loved had kept a secret from you for years, a painful and enormous secret, but kept it to protect you, could you forgive them? Not excuse it, not pretend it was simple, but actually forgive? Where's the line for you between a lie told out of love and a lie that's just a lie? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story moved you in any way, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Subscribe to Buddy Chronicle so you don't miss another story. And I will see you in the next one. My son is coming over for breakfast Sunday morning. My wife is already planning what to make. The grandchildren will be loud and the coffee will be strong and the table will be too small for everyone and none of us will care. Not bad, I think. For a man who spent 8 months standing at an empty grave. Not bad at all.